his workshop.
We've been exploring what it means to be created in the image of God.
Last time, we looked at how being God's image means we are princes and princesses in His kingdom. We are His children, so we are royalty.
Today, we will build on that concept. We are God's children. So, what can we do as God's children? We imitate God. Our creation in God's image naturally implies that we're called to imitate Him. Paul said this explicitly in Ephesians. Watch what God does, and then you do it, like children who learn proper behavior from their parents. So, what does God do that we are to do?
In Genesis, we find our first calling. Then God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and govern it, reign over the fish and the sea, the birds in the sky, and all the animals that scurry along the ground." Here, we see that our first calling was to procreate and govern. Why would that be our first calling? Because that is what God did, and He shared that purpose with Adam and Eve. God expanded His kingdom by creating the world. He filled it with life of all kinds, and He gave a measure of this creative, expansive power to Adam and Eve by giving them the ability to procreate. And just as God governs the entire universe, Adam and Eve were to govern their corner as God's vice regents. We are to reign as God reigns.
That sounds very noble. But let's break it down a bit. What does it look like to reign as God reigns? In the creation story, we see God lovingly prepare the world like parents prepare their nursery for the arrival of a baby. God provided everything needed to ensure a flourishing life, and He sustains life even today. So, as God imitators, we are to reign with love as providers and sustainers. We are not to be takers, but givers.
We were created to steward God's creation, to care for it as He cares for His entire kingdom. He entrusted to us to ensure that His kingdom ways are carried out here.
We've been using the term reign, but let's be honest. None of us feel like we're in a position of rulership.
No, at least not most of us, right? But our role as God's vice regents extends beyond rulership. It encompasses all areas and activities of life. It is a question of how we do things.
We were created to do all things as God will do them, to do them in the same spirit and in the same manner. I know we're all familiar with the old saying, "What would Jesus do?" Well, we can and we should add to it, how would Jesus do it? That's what being imitators of God is all about.
When we are properly aligned with God, everything we do can fulfill our mandate to represent God's rule on earth. As a father, I can represent God, the Father, to my children with His same love, tenderness, patience, and eagerness to teach. As a pastor, I can represent the Good Shepherd to my church with the same humility, self-sacrifice, grace, and willingness to train. As a member of society, I can represent God in the way I conduct myself and relate to others. I can ensure that people are provided for and that their dignity and value are protected.
There are so many ways that we can practice reigning as God does. Again, the guiding questions are, what would God do and how would He do it? We do the action and we honor the spirit behind it.
But there is a danger to reigning, especially as sinful people.
And what is the danger?
The danger is that our reign can become exploitative and destructive. Look at racism, for example, and its byproduct is slavery. Look at environment issues. So often we reign for our own benefit. We are supposed to reign as a sustainers and providers. But tragically, that is not what we always do.
Sadly, that is so true. But right from the beginning, God built a protection for us. That protection is the Sabbath. Let's look at Genesis. So the creation of the heavens and the earth and everything in them was completed. On the seventh day, God had finished his work of creation, so he rested from all his work. And God blessed the seventh day and declared holy, because it was the day when he rested from all his work of creation. God delighted in his creation, so he rested to enjoy it. As his imitators, we rest on the Sabbath too. And there's where the protection of Sabbath comes in. Sabbath is a weekly reset. We're reminded of our call to reign as God reigns.
Sabbath is a weekly reminder to lay our rulership before God, to recognize that God is the ultimate ruler, to remember who he is and how he reigns, and then we can return to reigning as he does.
Sabbath is also a weekly reminder to stop sustaining and recognize our utter dependence on God. And Sabbath is a weekly reminder that God is our sovereign, loving, created King. Sabbath protects us by helping us maintain a proper perspective of reality.
Sabbath is truly a blessing. And so is the broader concept of imitating God. God has made it clear who we are, what we are to do, and how we are to do it. In addition to being the example, he gave us the perfect example of how to imitate God in our sinful world.
And of course, the perfect example of imitating God is Jesus. Paul explained in Colossians that Jesus is the visible image of the invisible God. The way Jesus lived shows us what God is like.
And that is what we're called to do as God's imitators, to reflect him to the world the way Jesus did, to do what he does: love, rescue, provide, sustain, transform, create, forgive. To do all these things in the way that he does them, lovingly, with self sacrifice, mercy, grace, and benevolence.
There's still more to explore on this concept, so please join us next week. For now, let's consider our key questions. What is God doing in my life? Do I have the courage to be a part of his work? Am I truly willing to join him in his work of redemption in my life and all around me?